Hello, and welcome virtually to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands. I'm director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, and we're very pleased to have an outstanding panel to discuss the new nuclear and how it may help Canada and the United States to meet their environmental net zero commitments. The panel's outstanding. There are full bios on the website on which you are watching this event, but I'll just introduce them all to you briefly first. We have with us Alexandria Anderson, dropped an I for you, Alexandria, who is a public affairs advisor with Ontario Power Generation. Also, we have with us Heather Ferguson, who is a member of the Canada Institute's advisory board and senior vice president for corporate affairs at Ontario Power Generation. We're also pleased to have with us Mark Fisher, who is the chief executive officer of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, a binational group including Canadian and US jurisdictions, states and provinces. Finally, we're very pleased to have with us John Kotek. John is Senior Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs for the Nuclear Energy Institute here in Washington, DC. Now that you know our players, I'd like to get us started with a question for you, John. For someone like me, admittedly, not a technical expert, what are small modular nuclear reactors? What's the difference between that and what I might have known about before?
Sure. So when you think about nuclear as used in the US here today, we're typically talking about reactors that are 1,000 megawatts or more, very, very large in size. And so the small modular terminology describes both a smaller power output. So think in the tens or hundreds of megawatts rather than 1,000 or more. But also it refers to, a new approach to construction where it's sort of less stick built and more factory built. The other thing to think about, today's reactors in the US are cooled with water. Going forward, we may see small modular reactors that are water cooled, but there are also designs that are cooled with more novel coolants like liquid metals or gases or molten salts. So those are the primary differences.
Excellent, that's helpful. Is there also, just to follow up, is there also a cost difference in terms of the cost of building these?
Certainly in terms of total project cost, the cost should be lower. Now the power output is going to be lower too, but yeah, whereas building, say, 2 units of a large 1,000 megawatt plant can be, north of $10 billion today, these are intended to be, an order of magnitude less than that.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Heather, Ontario is a significant nuclear power installed capacity. You've been doing nuclear for a long time at Ontario Power Generation. And I know you recently undertook a refurbishment program for the reactors you had. How do SMRs figure in Ontario's current and future energy plans? Is this an opportunity for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you just a little bit of a lens on what Ontario and OPG have been up to on the refurbishment front, because those are some pretty significant projects that play into the long term for nuclear. So we've been working to refurbish our nuclear fleet since 2016. So both OPG at our Darlington facility, where we have our Darlington refurbishment project, but also Bruce Power, who is undertaking their major component replacement project. Just that's how they refer to their refurbishment. And so collectively, these projects, they're in excess of $25 billion of investment. So very, very significant for the sector. Really great, to be able to say both of these projects remain on time and on budget. And that's such a critical thing for what we're talking about here today. I think, there's a history of nuclear projects with cost overruns and things not faring well in the long run. And so I think it's really well understood by both OPG, Bruce Power, and probably the whole industry that we need to demonstrate that we can complete these refurbishments on time and on budget, really to pave the way for the future of the next wave of technology and SMRs. So, things have gone really well. We've got 1 unit back in service. We're rounding the bend on the 2nd unit, and this will be a decade-long project. So we won't complete all 4 until the end of 26, or well, somewhere in 26. Could be sooner. And it'll extend the plant's life by 30 years, which is huge. And the other thing that's kind of key about both these projects, I think, is the economic benefits to the region or to the province more particularly. And I think that's often the case with large projects in the nuclear sector. And we can speak about that even when it comes to SMRs. Yeah, they're smaller, but the benefits are huge. So, these refurbishments were, $90 billion of a boost to the economy and 14,000 jobs. I mean, I didn't pull those out of thin air. They were, we had a study done as one often does when you're thinking about economic contribution. So really huge. So those are the refurbishments, but you talked about SMRs and OPG is leading the way to develop Canada's first on-grid SMR. John spoke about the different sizes. So an on-grid SMR, roughly in the 300, 400 megawatt territory, but operating as early as 2028. So we're working, with 3 grid scale technology developers to advance the engineering work, the design work, and plan on deploying an SMR at Darlington. We're very fortunate to be in a really good position to be able to meet that timeline. We have an approved EA already, was done many years ago. We've been able to preserve that. We've recently renewed our site prep license with the CNSC. So, really excited about that. But also, John mentioned there's other SMRs that are smaller. So we're also working on what's called a very small modular reactor, a VSMR, roughly 5 megawatts, and this is through a joint venture with Global First Power and a company called Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation. And with that one, we're looking to deploy an off-grid commercial demo, I guess you would call it, at Chalk River. And this smaller off-grid one would be something that you could use more typically in heavy industry or mining remote communities. And that one's even actually on a slightly more aggressive timeline, looking to deploy that one around 26. So these are very near term, not far away prospects.
That's impressive. And right now, OPG is operating, would you say 18, 19 nuclear reactors total, or because this is adding to that amount?
So yeah, so you need to think about, so we've got Bruce Power in the province as well as OP. So there's 3 main reactors in Ontario. You've got Bruce Power, Ontario OPG's fleet, which includes Pickering and Darlington. So that's the collective fleet within Ontario. And yes, this Darlington new nuclear project SMR would add to that fleet. Slightly different size, but yes, and different technology.
Amazing. Excellent. Thank you very much. Mark, on the US side of the Great Lakes, we have a number of nuclear reactors as well. And I think 21 nuclear plants to use the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Region 3 as a baseline. And then a handful in like New York, because I know you work with New York and Pennsylvania as well. Why is nuclear energy so significant in this region and of Ontario and the Great Lakes, the whole Siegler region that you work with?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. I think when you look at the Great Lakes region, which as you know is made up of 8 states, New York to Pennsylvania, as well as the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, it's a regional economy that represents roughly $6 trillion in economic activity every year. If it was a country, that would make this region the 3rd largest economy in the world behind the United States and China, and before other major economies like Japan, the UK, and Germany. So it's a massive economy. It's a North America's economic engine in many ways. It's a significant industrial base. It's a region that's also home to 107 million people. Again, if it was a country, that would make it the 12th largest country in the world by population. And so when we think about economic growth and the environmental challenges that come with that, I think there is a collective understanding that we need to find pathways that improve our competitiveness, but we also need to find pathways that improve our environmental performance, our sustainability at the same time. And that includes reducing greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. And I think one positive aspect that we have as a region, one positive asset strength that we have, in this region when we think about competitiveness and sustainability, is our nuclear fleet. And I would argue that this nuclear fleet that we have on both sides of the border is probably the largest cluster, largest concentration of nuclear assets probably in the world. On a combined basis, nuclear power generates nearly 30% of the electricity for the entire region. About 50% of the emissions free electricity generated in the region. So it's an essential source of reliable, affordable, clean electricity for families and businesses. And I think when you look at the environmental benefits of that, this emissions free electricity annually, roughly avoids 250 million metric tons of CO2 in the air, which is equivalent to removing, at last estimate, over 52 million passenger cars from the road. And I think when you look at the jobs, the innovation that come with this sector, the 55 nuclear units that, are operating across the region employ, upwards of 80,000 people through direct and indirect employment. The industry itself combined, injects roughly 10 to 12 billion a year into the regional economy, again, through direct and indirect spending and operational equipment, supplies, materials, labor income, the retrofits, the renovations that Heather talked about. And, over 90% of the spending is done within each of the facility's own regions and states and provinces. And so that creates a positive impact on local and state provincial economies. So, it's a big economy. It's home to a lot of businesses and obviously families. And I think nuclear has shown itself in the past to be a significant, reliable baseload and an affordable baseload for fueling and powering this region's economy forward. So it's a really important asset to the region.
Absolutely, and clearly with those numbers, it has to be. Alexandria, if I'm right, I think you've just come back from Glasgow and the United Nations Conference of Parties on Climate Change, I think the 26th meeting, COP26. As somebody who was on the ground in Glasgow, and I know they're wrapping their talks up today, can you shed some light on how nuclear energy was being discussed or received by global leaders as a means to get to net zero? What are people talking about globally?
Yeah, it was such an inspiring time being there. I think from my perspective, this COP really reflected a growing urgency in achieving net zero and climate change emission targets. I felt in Paris, we saw a lot of promises on reduction, and in Glasgow, we were having active discussions on how to achieve these promises. So, through my time in Scotland, I did find there was a growing recognition that nuclear does need to be part of the solution and the discussion in order to meet those ambitious targets. We've really yet to see a credible decarbonization plan to get to net zero without the role of nuclear. And I feel that some countries that were maybe hesitant before are starting to see that. We now have countries that are explicitly including nuclear in their climate strategies, including the US, you have France and the UK, and they're making big investments in SMRs in their climate policy. So it was really exciting to see countries and climate leaders like Mark Carney showcase their support for nuclear, and that recognition that, relying solely on renewables just won't fit all of the global needs. So, over the past 2 weeks, we saw a lot of discussions around the global need to accept nuclear as a key clean source of power, and that being instrumental to getting to net zero. I'm finding that people are now approaching the issue of net zero's contribution to the climate change more objectively, with much better deposition now. I think we all know that without the current contribution of nuclear, all the figures and the stats and the facts and the graphs that we're seeing at COP, they would be much worse than they are. So, even bringing it back to Canada, we saw Prime Minister Trudeau even indicate that nuclear and SMRs have to be part of the role in meeting climate targets. So, overall, I felt in previous years, nuclear has kind of been a silent champion at COP, but we're starting to see that change a little bit. So it's exciting to see, and I'm excited to see how Canada moves forward once Parliament resumes.
Me too. I know that we have such ambitious targets now that how you do it without hydroelectric and nuclear is really hard to square with just the important demand. Thanks for that. Heather, I also know that at COP26, there was a lot of discussion, at least from the reporting, on climate finance. And I wonder, how do financial markets assess SMR nuclear projects and how does nuclear fare in the various environmental social governance scoring systems that are out there? Is this something that's going to have finance support, or is it going to be a challenge to fund these projects? Because they're obviously big.
Yeah, I mean, I can give some perspective, but I'll be the first to admit I'm not a finance expert, but had an opportunity to kind of get some feedback and get some insights from those who know more than I do on this, and it's been a tricky question for some time on what meets the definition of clean energy and what's considered green. And it continues to be debated today, but there's been significant movement on the inclusion of nuclear in the financial taxonomy and how it's defined and what it's eligible for. And I think we're going to see, personally, an increasing demand for this from the market as investors look for sustainable ways to invest their funds, and increasingly want to recognize nuclear and the role it will have to play. So I think it's quite a positive state of things. It's improving, or maybe is what I could say. So in the EU, they are working to have nuclear included in their EU taxonomy, which I think is quite a leadership role. I don't think they're quite at the point of having a final decision on that, but I gather there's a market expectation that nuclear will be part of the taxonomy in some form. It could potentially be slightly differentiated from other clean technologies, but it's getting there. And I mean, in US and Canada, we're not in that same stream. We don't quite have that same taxonomy defined as compared to the EU. But, I think in Ontario and Canada, we've consulted with a lot of investors, and many of the investors are open to considering nuclear as green. And so we're making good headway. But I think it's incumbent upon US, Canada, really to work with our European partners on this, to build some sort of a consistent global understanding of the definitions. And that's going to form a very, very key part of the financing as we go forward. But if I can just take a minute maybe to talk more generally about financing of these SMR projects and nuclear as you move ahead, it's a pretty tight global race out there. And when we look at the landscape, there is I would say, in all honesty, some risk of Canada falling a bit behind other countries without government support and without some signals, I guess, from the government. Other jurisdictions, the US and the UK, have announced very bold programs and strong support, and within the form of billions of dollars. And I think Canada's getting there, but I think we just need to keep pushing, because if we're going to compete on a global stage, I think there needs to be those supports from the federal government and the signals, because then investors are going to follow that signal, and they're going to invest in areas where they see fairly strong government support, also to support their interpretation of some investment risks. So I think it's looking really positive, but I think we still have some work to do.
Well, understandably. Thanks for that, Heather. Mark, we've been looking at this from the point of view of just building reactors. We know how to do it, but what are some of the ingredients that go into making this kind of economy work? I'm thinking in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of anything. We hear about critical minerals and other things that have to be done for renewable technology. Where do you see the choke points, and what do we need to do, or what can governments do to help enable the emergence of this sector?
Yeah, great question, Chris. I guess when I look at it from a Canada-US perspective, I think it's fair to say, and focusing in on the Great Lakes region, that the level of interconnectedness between the economies, as is significant. This region alone produces 50% of the total value of goods that move across the Canada-US border every year. And so you've got shared industries and shared supply chains, from defense to agriculture to advanced manufacturing, energy, you name it. And so I think at a very, very high level, when the president, the prime minister, through their roadmap, talk about supply chain resiliency and supply chain security, when they meet in a couple of weeks in terms of the North American Leaders Summit, we need to really put that shared competitiveness, those shared supply chains, front and center, and make sure that there are real commitments to leverage those strengths. We talk a lot about Buy America and Buy American, and perhaps some of these more protectionist measures that you see all around the world. So on the one hand, we talk about the importance of supply chain security and resiliency. On the other hand, we are adopting domestic policies at various levels that kind of gum up some of those supply chains and the access to those critical minerals, those critical pieces of infrastructure, whether it's steel, whether it's aluminum, that we should be sharing easily back and forth across the border to support our economies. And we just think about critical minerals alone. We know that China has traditionally had a monopoly on rare earth minerals, critical minerals. But I think looking forward, there are deposits that are in Canada, that are in the United States. We need to be not only looking at how do we develop those resources responsibly, but also how do we share them back and forth across the border, because they are critical elements in terms of our renewable energy industry, our clean tech industry, our defense industry, agriculture, you name it. There isn't a sector today that doesn't rely on critical minerals and rare earths. So there is a competitiveness and I think a national security interest for us to be developing these resources, sharing these resources more efficiently across the border as we develop these industries. In particular, I'd say traditional nuclear. I'm not an expert in SMRs, don't know how they'll fit within SMRs, but it will certainly be important for the energy economy. I think beyond that, though, we also have to recognize that we have a substantial amount of materials in our economy today that already include critical minerals and rare earth minerals. So how are we collecting, for example, those electronics, recycling those electronics and recovering those critical minerals? Because there is a supply already in our economy. So it's part, how do we mine and use that to our strategic advantage in North America, but also how do we collect and recover those critical minerals that are already in our economy and doing that to our mutual benefit going forward. So it's a great question, Chris. I don't think that we have all the solutions and pathways and policies in place, but it's absolutely an issue that we have to be talking about because I don't think we can be relying on China forever when it comes to rare earth minerals.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. You're right. And it gives you a sense of the scale of the work that we have to do, assuming that even our other allies are going to be doing similar things. So the supplies have to go up. Absolutely. John, your former colleagues in the Department of Energy have, I think, noted SMR capacity as key for incremental power additions, and that's a key advantage for SMRs over sort of other earlier reactor types and some of the alternatives that we have out there going towards net zero. And I'm also thinking, because we're talking about the Midwest, with electric vehicles as being very much in the sights of our automakers, how do you see SMRs contributing to our current baseload, but also the expansion of our generating capacity so that we are able to support a transition to electric transportation?
Yeah, really great question, because you look at the president's goals, for example, to decarbonize certainly the grid by 2035, but our broader energy economy by 2050. That means you're going to have to start addressing things like transportation, right? And a big part of the job is going to be, electrify those things you can to wean them off of fossil fuels. That means you're going to need to, here in the US, roughly double the size of, our electric grid, right? Double the amount of production at a time when you're taking things like coal and increasingly natural gas, out of the picture because of carbon and climate concerns. And so you're going to need something that is both carbon-free and firm, right? Available 24/7 to fill the gap. And what our utilities are finding, what our energy analysts and our policymakers are finding is that, having a significant share of firm, clean generation helps keep costs down and reliability up, right? As we make this transition to 100% carbon-free. Firm and clean today, that means nuclear, right? It means existing nuclear, it means small modular reactors. There are certainly other technologies under development, gas with carbon capture, for example, or deep geothermal. There are other tools I'm sure we'll bring to bear over the coming decades. But nuclear is far and away the largest source of firm, clean generation we have today, and it's got a tremendous opportunity going forward to fill that role. And frankly, the understanding of the role it can play in holding costs down, keeping reliability up, and frankly, creating thousands of well-paying long-term jobs while we're at it is a big part of the reason why you see such overwhelming bipartisan agreement on nuclear energy as one of the handful of things that our Republicans and Democrats here can actually find agreement on in the clean energy space. So huge potential role for SMRs and existing nuclear to address the challenge you pointed out.
Well, as a fellow Washingtonian, I know bipartisan consensus is hard to come by sometimes. And so something which has some appeal on both sides of the aisle could be critical going forward. Heather, back to you. I admit I am a nerd for these things because I always follow Canada. I love to read reports. But I noted that SMRs were the focus of the 2018 steering committee that was convened by Natural Resources Canada and the Canadian Nuclear Association. And I know that because they produced a report called A Call to Action, the Canadian Roadmap for Small Modular Nuclear Reactors. Why did Canada identify SMRs early and worthy of a separate roadmap back then? And what's generally been the reaction to that 2018 report is on the part of both proponents, industry, consumers, even skeptics in the environmental movement? What do you sense that impact was?
Well, it's good that you remember that, because that actually seems a lifetime ago in terms of thinking about how much has gone on in the nuclear and SMR space since then. But I mean, why was that report commissioned, or why did a very diverse and national group of people come together to look at it from all different aspects, including economic, technical, socioeconomic? So I think there's recognition, and it's kind of the things we're all sort of saying here today, that SMR technologies represent such a huge potential for Canadian leadership, and just sort of building a bit off of Ontario's experience in the nuclear sector. So having been an operator for better part of 50 years, really a chance to take it to that next level, or move on to that next iteration, that next generation of technology. And I think that was recognized, but it was also recognized is that nuclear is going to have to play a role in meeting climate change goals. So I think, it was recognized that both on-grid and off-grid applications will be critical. It's going to be critical for the resource sector. It's going to be critical for decarbonizing industry. And it's going to be critical for some of our Indigenous and remote communities. So I think there was recognition early on that there was no way we were going to get to net zero if we didn't spend some more time understanding, what role SMRs play. And then I also think, there was some recognition of the huge export potential. And I think there's been estimates of something in the order of $150 billion a year. And this is as countries, seek to meet their net zero emissions targets and climate change goals. There's that huge potential as well. So I think that is why, there was a recognition. But, as I said, it wasn't just the roadmap from 2018 that we've since seen the next iteration of that, which is the SMR action plan that came out at the end of 2020. But also, I think, I would mention the provinces. So, those were pieces that were put forward by the federal government, and largely, Intercan was hugely supportive of that and showed great leadership there. But the provinces within Canada, many of them have also been showing real leadership in trying to advance SMRs. And I think, to your point, I think it has been very well received. So there's been an interprovincial MOU. So, Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and most recently Alberta have signed on as part of sort of a pan-Canadian SMR initiative, looking at ways that across the country we can reduce emissions and work collaboratively. So this MOU was signed, and OPG is working with, with a jurisdiction, for example, like Saskatchewan, who is not currently a nuclear operator, but sees tremendous potential with SMRs as they look to get off coal. And so I think there's been leadership on both sides there. And, I think I look forward to seeing more next steps from the federal government as the action plan unfolds.
It's similar to my comment to John. Bipartisan consensus is hard to come by in Washington, but federal provincial consensus can be quite a miracle when you find it happening in Canada. So that's actually a really encouraging sign. Mm-hmm. I hate to go back to something that happened before COVID, because I think when you said 2018 was a while back, that was the first thing I thought. Yes, it was before COVID. But John, in 2019, mm-hmm. The United States launched the Advanced SMR R&D program with the objective of, as I understand it, establishing an advanced reactor pipeline. Has this started to bend the cost curve for new reactors downward? And what's the trend in this sort of application to operation timeline for, say, an SMR project in the US? Because I know sometimes you need a lot of lead time to bring these kind of projects together.
Yeah, and to that last point, certainly, getting the first of a kind, getting the designs licensed through our Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and then getting the supply chain ready to actually go off and construct is going to take some time. But of course, those are things you do once, right? And then you're able to move much more quickly once you've got the first of a kind in place. To your point about the SMR program, Yeah, that has been very impactful. There was also a program called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that was actually created by Congress. It's being implemented by our Energy Department. So all told, we're going to see multiples of these SMRs or advanced reactors in demonstration in initial deployment this decade. What's happening in the US is our policymakers are learning from the success that we had with wind and solar. So if you go back 30 years, we passed the initial tax credits for wind power, for example. But it wasn't just that, it was the state level renewable portfolio standards, which are now increasingly becoming clean energy standards, plus the R&D investments that our federal government was making alongside our industry. Those things came together to create the conditions under which the private sector was willing to make the investments needed to really drive these technologies down the cost curve. The big game changer in the US was about a dozen years ago when we were coming out of, or trying to come out of, the recession, and we had the Recovery Act, which provided a real financial shot in the arm for wind and solar. And the technologies have taken off, and now they cost a fraction of what they did a decade or so ago. We've done a lot of the R&D investment here in the US. We're starting to see the other types of policies. States are moving from renewable standards to clean energy standards that embrace nuclear. Our Congress is looking at a system of tax credits that would actually incentivize nuclear alongside other clean energy technologies. We're seeing states or utilities move to 100% carbon-free commitments. All of these things are coming together in a way that are going to, in my view, create the demand pull that we need to see the really sustained investment from our private sector to build out that supply chain and really bend that cost curve. So to your question about bending the cost curve, we're on the right track to make that happen. Excellent.
That is good, because I know we're spending a lot in this particular crisis with the new infrastructure bill, and pennies count. So that's really helpful. Alexandria, I want to come back to you. During COP26, the State Department announced that the U.S. is going to commit $25 million to expand access to clean nuclear energy through a framework called the Nuclear Futures Package. And the package includes commitments to a number of SMR-related initiatives, including, if I'm reading this right, the responsible use of small modular reactor technology initiative and a U.S. SMR public-private partnership program. Can you project what the impact of these initiatives might be for nuclear energy in North America, maybe broader than just the Midwest and maybe even beyond?
Yeah. Honestly, it was a really exciting couple of weeks. We did see a lot of announcements come out of COP this year regarding new builds and investments in nuclear. And on the US program, it definitely reflects an increased inclusion of nuclear technologies to meet the climate challenge. And now with Canada and other countries seeking a means to meet net zero commitments, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that there's no path forward without nuclear. I think from my view, the first movers in these technologies will definitely create new markets and opportunities that will create jobs and investments. So it's quite inspiring, but at the same time, we'll send a strong signal to Canada and other jurisdictions to jump on board. From the inclusion and acceptance of nuclear in North American discussions around climate change, we're excitingly seeing countries like Ghana and Kenya and Poland now considering nuclear energy to meet their electricity shortages and address the climate target. So, the US is all in on nuclear, and the Biden administration definitely understands that nuclear needs to play a role in order to meet these 2035 goals that they've made. And I think from my perspective, with the US focusing on its investments on long-term operations and existing reactors, as well as emerging technologies like SMRs, this is going to lead to a possible acceleration of new nuclear and electrification, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, but decarbonization as a whole.
It's funny, as I sometimes think about North America taking a step out, trying to think about how we look to the rest of the world. And I know we have a reputation of loving technology and being early adopters. If we're able to deploy successfully the technology, show that it works, do you think that will be a bit of a inspiration, or maybe provide a leadership from North America to other parts of the world, including the developing world, where, you know, proof of concept is important. And if they're going to sink a lot of money into trying to move in this direction to meet their net zero commitments, I'm sure they want to have something tried and true or tested and shown to work. What's your sense of the wider debate once you get out of North America? What are developing countries talking about? What are other European and other jurisdictions looking at?
Yeah, you know, I think it's weird. I feel like a lot of everybody wants to be the second, but not necessarily the first. We're talking about it a lot, but not really a lot has been moving, and this is something that needs to be done urgently. So I applaud the U.S. and the U.K. for actually making those investments, and I'm hoping that Canada really does step up and make those commitments sooner rather than later.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Mark, back to you. You know, the U.S. and Canada clearly from this discussion have a similar interest in making a commitment to net zero by 2050 and SMRs as part of that equation. In 2015, the Council of Great Lakes region published a report on nuclear power's future in the region. And the report noted, and I'm going to quote, I had to write this down so I'd get it right. Moving forward, nuclear energy will play an important role in the Great Lakes region's modern, balanced electricity system, while governments continue to focus on policies that will grow their economies and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's a lot, it's a mouthful, but 6 years later, from when that was written, was the assessment correct looking back? And do you think it's true now, or maybe even more so?
Yeah, I absolutely think it was a correct statement at the time. You know, obviously we have an existing fleet that's incredibly important to the region. I will admit there was a very different conversation, and John and Heather know this. There's a very different conversation about nuclear on the Canadian side than there is across some of our 8 Great Lakes states, you know, writ large. But I think there is a recognition that it is a core energy source for the region. And, you know, sort of fast forward to where we are today, we're actually seeing states that were talking about decommissioning their assets, rethinking, you know, some of those decisions and choices, whether it's, you know, Illinois or others. And so we've got this existing asset base that we could be retrofitting and refurbishing for the future. And then how do we add in new capacity, whether it's SMRs or, you know, new technologies that perhaps can fuel themselves off of the legacy waste that we do have and manage and own, you know, as part of this nuclear fleet. I think we have to recognize that it's there. You know, there are some technologies being talked about, you know, Bill Gates being one of them, that, you know, has technology that potentially can fuel itself off of that waste going forward. So I remain bullish in terms of the role that nuclear can play in this region. You know, as we think about bringing on other sources of energy, whether it's renewable, solar, hydro, we kind of need all things working together, and that includes battery storage and what have you. But I do think that nuclear can and should play that strong, affordable, clean base load. And then hopefully, you know, outside the technology question, you know, back to the waste issue, I think if we are going to increase the prominence of nuclear in our economy, both countries, we're going to have to find a way of managing the legacy waste in a responsible way. And it has been managed in a responsible way to date. But I think we do need to find a lasting solution on that issue. I don't think we can talk about nuclear in the Great Lakes region, in all fairness, without talking about some of the waste challenges that we do have. And I know that the general public, if we want to increase their confidence in nuclear, they want to see a solution to that issue and a long-term solution. So I don't want to have this virtual event without talking about that important element, because I know from a public interest standpoint, there are communities that are concerned about that issue. And I know that we can find pathways and solutions to that problem, you know, as both countries put their head together in terms of how do we use nuclear for the future. So.
Yes, John, can I sort of fast response to you, because I know some of these SMR technologies allow you to reprocess some of the waste product of other reactors. Is that something that's still on the drawing board, or is that a viable option, at least in part, to the waste issue that Mark?
You know, yeah, I describe it as something that's in the drawing board. It's certainly, you know, possible to do from a technical standpoint. At the moment, it's less cost effective than just creating new fuel, and so that's how I expect to see things go forward in the near term. Over the longer term, certainly our companies and our government are engaged in research that might make that more feasible down the road.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thanks very much for that.
Chris, could I just go a little rogue here and just offer a little bit of perspective on the waste piece?
Absolutely, Heather, please.
Yeah. Just building a little bit off what Mark said. I wholeheartedly 100,000% agree. We do need a long-term solution to the used fuel part of the waste. And I think we're seeing some leadership from the federal government on that in relooking at waste policy and what needs to go alongside that. And I continue to look to them to be a real partner on this and find a long-term solution. And OPG will absolutely work alongside them, as will the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that is accountable for that. But I think it's always really important to think about waste in the truest of terms. And when we think about various technologies, and there's no question that all technologies are going to be needed for us to reach net zero, but some of those technologies, or maybe I will say nuclear is the only technology that has a waste stream, and we've got to get away from calling it waste. We're going to call it byproducts or something a little bit more appropriate, that's fully accounted for from a life cycle cost perspective. Every piece of that waste, we have a clear line of sight of exactly where it is, and we have a highly regulated sector that stores it safely and manages it and monitors it. So I know some of these messages will fall on deaf ears and will never be appreciated by those that are true opponents of nuclear and nuclear waste. But I do think it's something that, as we get out there and have the conversation with more people that are more worried about climate change, perhaps, and educate them about how nuclear waste is managed in Canada and in other parts of the world, maybe that's an important part of the conversation to have as well.
Thank you. That wasn't too rogue at all. Really appreciate that intervention. I'm going to mention, for those of you who are watching this live stream, we'd like to invite you to ask us some questions. You can send in questions to canada@wilsoncenter.org. And if you're watching this in Canada, we've run into this problem before. It's Wilson Center ER, American spelling, as opposed to RE, the Canadian spelling. But if you send us in those questions by email, we'll try to get them all answered. And also you can send us a tweet. Our Twitter handle is @CanadaInstitute, all one word. But while we're waiting for that, I wanted to ask our panel sort of a question for all of you. And you've been dealing with this in different degrees, and you have different sort of perspectives. What are, for you individually, the most compelling reasons why nuclear is an option, nuclear power is an option for North America? Be that in in terms of net zero, be that in terms of cost, be that in terms of any other category. What really persuaded you in this regard, and what do you think of if you were making the argument to President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, what would you say? This is the reason. I think this is worth your time and attention. And I'll maybe go in the order that we had you start. So John, can I go to you first?
Sure. From a climate perspective, it's nuclear plus wind plus solar that's the balanced mix that's going to get us to an affordable, reliable, decarbonized grid. If I was speaking to President Biden, I would add in, and by the way, it's nuclear that creates the long-term, well-paying jobs that go along with your decarbonization agenda and really help meet the goals of your Build Back Better policy.
Excellent. Well said. Over to you, Heather. What do you think? If you were talking to Prime Minister Trudeau or even President Biden?
Okay, well, I'll take it with Trudeau because, we covered the Biden piece. And I agree with everything that's been said here. I think fundamentally you can't get to net zero as a country or a continent without nuclear. It's just the physical geography will not allow it. Renewables cannot provide all that's needed, and hydro isn't everywhere. And so we know it's necessary. But if I were actually having a conversation with Trudeau or members of his cabinet, I think there's so many things that this technology can offer from a climate change perspective, from an opportunity with Indigenous communities. We spoke about jobs and economic development already, but in furtherance of things that are incredibly important to that government. And so, I think when you're having a conversation about a technology like nuclear, try to put it through the lens of other things that are incredibly important to to that administration. And I agree, jobs, economic development, Indigenous communities, even the diversity piece. I think when we look across the nuclear sector now, I mean, historically, energy, mining, nuclear has been a very, well, a little bit more uniform looking group, but I think we're seeing more and more the nuclear sector is as everyone, embracing the need to have more diversity and more representation that's reflective of the communities in which we live. So those would be a handful of things that I would just share.
Very, very much appreciated. Mark, I'll slightly twist this question because I know you also deal with state and provincial politicians. And what do you think, for you anyway, would be what you would say to governors, to premiers, as well as federal leaders, if you like, but just to get that subnational component in there?
Yeah, I think when, if I was speaking to, state provincial governors in the Great Lakes region, and particularly those that have existing assets, I would remind them that nuclear power is the most efficient and reliable source of large scale around the clock electricity. I think nuclear plants in the region, maintain an average reliability of between 85 to 90%, with many power plants routinely operating, at close to 100% capacity over extended periods of time. And so, when we talk about decarbonization, there's just no way that we can afford to take this kind of asset out of the energy mix and expect to meet our climate future objectives, right? Those decarbonization objectives. And further that, if we want to further encourage that transition to a low carbon economy, whether it's looking at hydrogen, whether it's looking at electrification of our transportation sector, all of those again need not only a predictable supply of clean electricity, they need a significant amount more of electricity. And so really the asset that can provide that output is going to be nuclear, right? In my view. So I think it's an important asset in and of itself in terms of energy production, but I don't think that you can decarbonize the broader economy without it. And just as a final thought, just to reinforce what John was saying, I think when you look at the jobs and economic benefits, the innovations that can come with obviously, the traditional nuclear fleet, but also how we think about SMRs and new technologies in a region like the Great Lakes, the economic lift is significant.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thanks for that, Mark. And Alexandria, you were at COP26. You were hanging around Glasgow. It seems very glamorous to me because I was stuck here. But if you were talking to North American leaders, because you were at a lot of different sessions, you were listening to what people were saying, what do you think you would share as reasons for those of us who weren't there? If in terms of the global effort to tackle climate change, just what were the compelling arguments? How does nuclear fit in? And if you were talking to North American leaders who missed out, what would you try to bring them as a takeaway from Glasgow?
I mean, it's hard not to echo everything that everyone has said, but globally, I do see great positives for the industry, as I do believe, and I think we all do, that nuclear power will only play a bigger role to replace old coal and fossil fuel stations to meet future electricity demands and to get to those net zero goals. Nuclear is proven, it's effective, it's a low carbon energy source, and that's especially true in Canada, where we've been safely and effectively operating CANDU technology for 5 decades now. Off of what John said, in Canada, nuclear energy helps avoid 80 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. You can't really argue with those facts, right? So it's important to note that, we need nuclear plus renewables to get to that net zero goal that we're all so desperately trying to reach.
I'm reminded, my mother used to say, the perfect can be the enemy of the good. So she'd tell me to, just do your best, son. All right, so now I have another question, and I'm going to run through the panel on this one as well. I'm thinking in terms of practical challenges here. If you were again having a chance to sort of set the agenda for North American policymakers at any level you want, what are the enabling decisions they need to make? What do they have to do to really capitalize on nuclear power's potential that we've all talked about being very good for us, but like, how do we foster that? And John, I remember you were talking about the way in which wind started with research and then very quickly grew and became more viable and more cost effective. But want to try to give some homework to our politicians and their staffs who are maybe watching this event. What should they prioritize? What needs to happen? Let me start with you, John, because I'm going in the same order as all.
Sure. Yeah. And so to that earlier comment, there is kind of a continuum of policy imperatives. And in the early days, it is very much about incentivizing the technology development, the R&D piece of it. But as you get closer and closer to having a product that's ready for market, you need to move more and more of your emphasis onto demand-inducing policies. And we've seen that done very effectively here in the US, again, for wind and solar, combination of strong state and federal policies. I mean, for example, wind developers will tell me that more than half of the value from a wind project is in the incentives. It's not in the electricity sales, right? It's created a lot of demand pull. We're in the process of doing that same thing for nuclear and for other firm clean generation that we know are going to be needed alongside wind, solar, and storage to get to that affordable, reliable, decarbonized grid. So we're close. I'm not popping the cork on the champagne yet, but we're headed in the right direction here in the US. Then, of course, that will then shift to, okay, now we need to deliver, right? We need to see the supply chain build up and the project execution get better and better over time. I look forward to the day when that's when that's the biggest issue. But right now, we got to get the policy right. We're getting close.
Well, and given that it's only a little past noon, I'm glad you're not popping the cork on champagne. It's a bit early, even for me. Heather, how about you? What are the top policy priorities to make this happen in Canada and or the United States?
Well, I mean, I could drill down and pick like a specific policy or specific area, but I think really to make something like SMRs as successful as they possibly can be, which would of course be not just building one here, one there, but seeing, at a global scale. I think it really all comes down to some form of certainty. And when you're thinking about a new technology, that includes, this is probably covering everything, but like regulatory certainty. So, as I said, for us, we're in a pretty good spot. We, with the SMR, we're looking to put at Darlington. We have an EA in place. We have a license or a site prep license in any case from the CNSC. So that puts us in a pretty good stead on the regulatory certainty front, but there's going to be others that aren't quite in that place. We're in a fairly unique position. So for them, something like regulatory certainty is important. Financial certainty. I spoke about, the notions around, what is nuclear considered? Is it considered green? Is it considered clean? How can you finance something like that? Community and stakeholder certainty. So how do you, galvanize those relationships with your communities? And if you don't have some form of community and stakeholder support, you're just not, you're not going to get there. So I think it really comes down to thinking about policy through the certainty lens, if I'm thinking about it.
Excellent. Sorry to be slow off the mute, but that's very helpful. All right, so now over to you, Mark. What are the priorities as a regional group? Council of the Great Lakes Region has been looking at this for a while. If you were putting some top targets for policymakers to consider if they want to achieve this this nuclear power potential, what's on your list?
Well, I think Heather rightly touched on three of the big ones, to be honest. And I think that demonstrates the maturity of the conversation on the Canadian side, and some of that certainty that exists is, you need the regulatory certainty. In places like Ohio, nuclear has been kicked around, in an odd way. And so I think we need to have that policy certainty, the political certainty, the regulatory certainty. I think that the financing needs to be there. I'm convinced that we need to be looking at how do we extend the life of some of our existing assets in the Great Lakes region, which is a bit of a shift away from decommissioning. So where we can extend the life, we should be extending the life, where we can be making finance and capital available to be building some of that new nuclear. I think we need to be looking at that. And all of that has to happen in the context of engaging your communities and your stakeholders. And again, this is where I see a very stark contrast between the US and Canada. is that a number of communities are really trying to run away from nuclear. And to be honest, I don't understand it. I think there's a view out there that the renewables, the wind and the solar are going to power everything. And there's sort of an anti-natural gas, anti-nuclear, sort of movement underway. And I think we need to have a really frank and tough and honest conversation with our communities and industries across the region about how all sources of energy are going to play an important role, but that we need that strong baseline, and that has to be nuclear, in my view. And so, I think level setting that conversation the right way in the U.S. is going to be important. We're starting to see some great signals from Great Lakes leaders like Secretary Granholm, who is now talking about nuclear more than I've ever seen the administration talk about nuclear, which is great. So I think that those are some important points that Heather talked about: the regulatory, the financial, and the community engagement.
Excellent. Now over to you, Alexandria, and then we have some questions from our audience, which I'll run around before we close.
Yep, I'll be real quick, because I think, again, I'm pretty much echoing the rest of the panelists here. I think that from what I saw at COP, at least, I do want to say the public perception, like just education as a whole. There's so many people that just weren't aware of nuclear and what we were doing. Just even telling them, nuclear power plants are operational in 30 countries worldwide. It was like, whoa, like I didn't know that. I didn't know how much nuclear was helping to fill that gap. I think right now all eyes are pretty much on the EU, and I think that will help change some of the perceptions around it. And if they do say that it is as sustainable as renewable technologies, or at least it's needed to transition to that clean economy that we're aiming for, that will help some of the misinformation that's out there. Yeah.
Wonderful, excellent, all very good points. So now we'll do, I hate to call it a speed round, but I want to make sure that we get some of the questions from our audience out to you, because it really gives us a sense of what people are thinking as they react to what you have had to say. So the first question, and maybe I'll send this to you, John, but feel free to divert it if it doesn't match you perfectly. The question is, does storage hydro in the region facilitate high capacity factors in nuclear plants by using sort of stored energy in terms of water behind the dam to level out or to follow load?
Certainly having that type of flexibility available on the system helps today's nuclear run in the sort of 24/7 mode that, at least here in the US, we found is most advantageous for our nuclear plants. In the future, we've actually got some designs. For example, TerraPower in their Natrium design is building storage into their concept. So they'll have a molten salt heat capacity connected to the plant that will allow them to divert power output to storage instead of electricity if the electricity isn't needed on the grid. So I think going forward, you're going to see more and more designs building in greater and greater flexibility to better match with a clean energy system. Thanks.
Oh, excellent. Thanks, John. And a question that actually has been directed to Heather in particular. Just thinking of Ontario, where should nuclear, he calls it byproducts, he was listening, be stored in the future? What are some of the options for handling that you're seeing or that you're contemplating, if you can tell us?
Yeah, I mean, not all nuclear byproducts or waste are the same, I guess. There's low, intermediate, and used fuel. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is currently assessing a couple options for the used fuel. Long-term repository, deep geological repository. So there's a couple of jurisdictions that are looking at it. And I'll tell you, in all honesty, many communities wanted to host a long-term used fuel storage facility. They saw the merits of it. And so, a couple of communities are under consideration right now, and it's part of a longer-term process to site this. And the siting of it and the actual, commissioning won't be out until actually the 2040s, which seems like a very, very long time away, but that's the timeline. So there's South Bruce and Ignace are a couple of communities in Ontario that are under consideration right now. Excellent.
Thank you, Heather. A quick question. I think I'm going to steer this one to you, Mark, but feel free to demur. Just an observation that former NRCan Minister, Natural Resources Canada Minister Seamus O'Regan was a real champion for SMRs, giving him credit where credit's due, and probably the biggest, according to this questioner, champion in Canada since Jean Chrétien to be so bullish about nuclear power. What is your sense of the outlook now in the new cabinet? Do you think we'll see something similar from Jonathan Wilkinson? And does Stephen Guilbeault, as Environment Minister, have a public attitude on nuclear one way or the other? I know you follow those things.
Yeah, no, great question. I think for Minister Wilkinson, I think you'll see him talk about nuclear and the energy mix that required with probably the same level of ambition that we saw with the last minister. I think there is a broad recognition that we need to have nuclear and SMRs as part of, Canada's approach to responding to climate change and getting to that low carbon future. And, I think as it relates to environment and climate change Canada, I'm not sure where the new minister stands exactly on it, but I think there's a recognition that, when Minister Wilkinson was in the portfolio, when Minister McKenna was in the portfolio, there were a number of important regulatory changes that were pursued and have been adopted and are being implemented, such as the carbon pricing mechanisms and other things. And so right now it's really focused on implementation. Of those measures. There'll certainly be some additional measures that will be sought in terms of controlling methanes in the oil and gas industry. But a lot of those sort of pointed policy changes, have been adopted and enacted and are being implemented. And so you're going to see a lot more, I think, collaboration between Environment Canada and NRCan as it relates to what more can we do in terms of that energy future, with probably NRCan playing a much stronger role in terms of how do we design those energy policies, those energy pathways that really decarbonize the economy. But I fully expect that Minister Wilkinson will take up the nuclear support and support for SMRs as his colleague Pryor did.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. And Alexandria, I'm going to combine two questions because you've so recently been in Europe. One question that we have is that it appears the European Union is moving closer to a consensus on nuclear despite German opposition. Do you see that as a turning point potentially for the world's acceptance of nuclear as a green technology? And a second question notes that there has been some discussion of floating SMRs that Russia is developing. So maybe Russia, Europe, throw them all together. What's your sense of where the international community is now, and whether North America is ahead or catching up?
Oh, that's a tough question. So from COP, I'm just gonna give from my little stint there. It kind of seems that North America is a little bit behind. You saw a lot of announcements in the UK and France, Russia. They're talking about nuclear. They understand nuclear. They clearly know that there is a need for it. And I think as the world is becoming less tolerant again on that dirty coal and fossil fuel generation, nuclear power is going to need to step up and fill that gap. I think most people are not, or the Canada, sorry, it hasn't really seen that yet. And we're still thinking about it, but those announcements still haven't come, right? So I'm happy to see that the US has made those announcements, but still kind of playing that catch-up game to get there, where they're actively making investments in countries in Europe so far.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thanks to all of our questioners who sent in questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But I suspect, given the tone of the conversation we've had today, this won't be the last word on nuclear in North America. We'll be returning to this subject, I hope, many, many times. But it falls to me to say thank you to our panel. Alexandria Anderson, Heather Ferguson, Mark Fisher, and John Kotek. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your time. And thanks for helping to at least educate me on the nuclear potential for North America. It's very exciting.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.